presentations by the recipients of our SSMART grants, the Social Science Meta-Analysis and Research Transparency Grant. This program is generously funded by the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, so we thank them for that. And we're excited about this. We got actually a lot of interest, and so we actually gave more grants in the first year because we got tons of great applications than we originally thought. So we're happy about that. What we are doing with these grants, we divided them into three categories. So or we were looking for three categories: developing innovative methods to improve the transparency and credibility of research findings, 2, developing new tools and approaches for meta-analysis, and 3, studies of researcher norms and strategies to promote the practice of open science. We had 39 proposals, and so these up here are the recipients of these grants, and so this research hasn't been done yet. They're just going to tell you in 5 minutes or less what they are hoping, what they are planning to do.
So thanks again, everyone, for staying for this final session. Really appreciate it, and thanks as well to BITSS and the Arnold Foundation for supporting this. So my project is developing reporting guidance for trial protocols of interventions in the social sciences. The main objectives are to see which items stakeholders in this area consider the most essential to be in a trial protocol to address a lot of the issues that we've been talking about with regards to having enough information to replicate the study, replicate the intervention, establish pre-analysis plans, for example, to prevent p-hacking, harking, all of those fun acronyms and names that are coming out. The second question was what inspired the project, I believe. So I was part of a group that developed an extension of the consort statement, which is the consolidated standards for reporting trials for social and psychological interventions. And that focuses on the tail end of the research process, namely the publication of the final trial results. And the group behind Consort, namely those who run the Equator Network, which is yet another acronym in this alphabet soup, who are focused on improving the use of reporting guidelines internationally, mostly in health research, but I think it really applies to behavioral and social science as well, realize that a lot of the guidelines that they're creating, while helpful, are at that tail end of the process. And so they started turning their attention to developing guidance for protocols. So SPIRIT is the standard protocol items for reporting intervention trials. And much like Consort, while I think very highly relevant to the trials that we do, was developed by and developed for people from more of a biomedical background, investigating interventions like pharmacological interventions, surgeries, etc. And much like with Consort SPY, we think that there are some important differences that may need to be in that type of guidance for interventions that are done in fields like developmental economics, education, social work, etc. So with a lot of the legwork for this, I think, already done through the Consort project, we're really grateful to have this grant to do another online Delphi exercise with stakeholders in this area, with the focus now being on protocols and seeing which items trialists themselves, systematic reviewers, journal editors who might end up publishing the trials, those who run registries like the AEA registry, RIDE, the new SREE registry that's being built, which ones they think are essential to include in protocols of trials of these interventions that aim to address various outcomes to improve the lives of those we're trying to serve. And I can't remember what the last question was that we're supposed to address. I don't know if we want to go back to that, Garrett, if that's possible. Intended impacts, right. So our hope is that this is a tool that will be useful for multiple stakeholders in this area, the trialists themselves, to not only have transparent and comprehensive protocols, but also even help them think through some issues they might not have thought through without such guidance. It might be useful to registries or to journals who publish protocols to ensure that the things that they are putting out into the public have accurate, comprehensive, and transparent information that's harmonized across these different sources. I think someone indicated one problem with the registries is the heterogeneity of information that's contained within and across them. And so hopefully that when the final trial is published, we have a better understanding of what changed in the trial design, what didn't change, and have more confidence in the results, and also have the ability to determine the quality of the final study, and if we think the intervention's great, replicate it and assess its potential applicability to our populations and settings of interest in a new context. So I think that's hopefully under 5 minutes. Happy to answer any questions later, and thanks for your time.
Thanks. What motivated this project is I think that the way that we do science in many fields is changing. In an age of big data and rapidly evolving statistical techniques, the frontier of knowledge is moving very quickly, and we need new ways to keep tabs on what we know about any question, ways that can evolve collaboratively, that we can keep up to date as a community, and that we can use to provide those results to other communities. So over the past 3 years, we built such a system, the Distributed Meta-Analysis System, DMAS, which allows people to contribute their statistical results. It's distributed in that anyone can open up a new area in our database of results and mix and match results in ways to allow really an unlimited number of questions about the state of knowledge in a field. And that system built what was the backbone of the Risky Business project, looking at the effects of climate change in the US last year. Now the Risky Business project has evolved to a global scope. And as a result, the number of sectors that we're looking at, the number of areas has ballooned, and we need new techniques to use this kind of spatially distributed data. And so the purpose of the project is to create a set of techniques which we're calling spatial meta-analysis, to use spatial features in data. For example, we have in agriculture estimates for the impact of climate change on agriculture in the US, in India, China, Sub-Saharan Africa. For conflict, we have estimates for all of those, and Europe, global estimates, and 15 individual countries by the work of Sheng, Burke, and Miguel. And so we need to use all of these. So the key questions of our study are, how do we allow many estimates to be used in such a way that the contribution of each estimate changes from one location to the next? What do we use as a theory of the weights between these different estimates based on observable characteristics like the distance between where we're looking at making an estimate and where a study was done, and demographic and socioeconomic characteristics? And how do we make it all accessible? And this accessibility issue is really big, and that's why one of the most important members of our PI team, Brenda Chen, is coming to us from, she's a user experience designer at Google, and so she's going to help us take this really powerful tool, which over the last 3 years has grown to be not only powerful, but complicated, really tough for other people outside of our field to use, and help us make it accessible both in its current form and in the more complicated world that spatial data is going to open up. So I want to finish this with a sort of call to contribute to the system. If you're doing a meta-analysis or literature review of statistical results, please approach us and use our system as a way to both do your analysis, use our tools, and that you can open up sort of a forum for additional results to be put in and your analysis to evolve over time. If you are from a field that has a similar set of issues where the state of knowledge is evolving quickly, talk to us so that we can try to make this tool useful to fields outside of our own. And finally, if you if you want to allow your results to be accessible to a broader audience, to policymakers and to modelers, work with us, and we can you can use our online and API systems to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's not a picture of me up there. Okay, so this is a project about, as the name implies, power calculations and clustering. And this project was born out of some discussions among some econ grad students earlier this year. There were 3 or 4 of us who were all doing some power calculations for various RCT or RED type projects that we were involved in. And we were trying to figure out how to get some of the kind of traditional power calculation formulas to fit our particular contexts. And in particular, trying to ensure that some of the assumptions that go into these power calculations, these ex ante calculations that we're doing, would be in agreement with the types of assumptions that would be made in the ex post analysis that we actually perform once we have the data. And one area that we realized was particularly tricky but also interesting was thinking about correlated error structures in the data and how those might impact our power calculations, and that in only the most basic form is that really considered in a lot of power calculations that are currently in the literature. So in this project we hope to take those correlated error structures a little more seriously in terms of power calculations, and try to answer really 2 main research questions. One is just how can we start to think about correlated error structures or clustering standard errors in our power calculations, and then also if we're not doing this, what kind of effects might that have on the kinds of analyses that we can do once we actually have the data. And so we think this is important for transparency for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you're using the wrong assumptions in your power calculations, when it comes time to actually perform your analysis, there's going to be this interesting tension between making sure that the type of analysis you're undergoing is actually sufficiently powered, but also making sure that it's that it's really the correct and rigorous and right science that you should be applying to the data. And so I think understanding this trade-off a little bit better would be useful, and if we can shed some insights on how we might be able to perform these power calculations better before the experiment is designed, then maybe we can reduce this kind of tension that exists once we're actually analyzing the data. And then second, if we think that there is some kind of systematic underpowering of experiments because clustering isn't being considered in these power calculations, then it might lead to this case where what we're seeing actually published in the literature are only those studies that find particularly large treatment effects, because those that find smaller treatment effects might just be underpowered, and then you're faced with having to determine whether these null effects are truly null effects or if they're just underpowered studies. And so in order to get at these questions, we're hoping to first just derive some more general power calculation formulas that would allow for more arbitrary types of correlations among the errors of a data generating process. Hopefully over kind of a wide range of data generating processes that are often seen in kind of the experimental economics in the economics literature through RCTs or RED type experiments. So I think that'll be useful just to understand how these formulas differ from those that are traditionally used in power calculations. Then we also hope to use these formulas to run some Monte Carlo simulations, both simulating data sets under different types of error structures to understand the trade-offs between sample size and experimental power and minimum detectable effects. And then also using some data sets that are typically used in a lot of in economics work, and then simulate some treatment effects on these real-world data and understand how these trade-offs might exist in those data also. And once we have some of these kind of simulation routines written, we're hoping to write both some R and Stata code that we might be able to make publicly available, so that if you have your own data set and you want to understand these kind of power calculation trade-offs, you'll be able to do that also.
So my name is Etienne, but want to make clear this is Daniel Lakin's baby. I'm just a messenger here, part of the team. And so our project is examining the reproducibility of meta-analyses in psychology. And what inspired the project is the replicability crisis in psychology for individual studies. And so perhaps the concern also applied to meta-analyses, whereby design and analytic flexibility can lead to biased overall meta-analytic effect size estimates and hence invalid conclusions for theory and or applied context. And so the main approach will be to reproduce 20 meta-analyses selected from 2013 and 2014 issues of 3 prominent psychology journals that typically publish meta-analyses. Teams will reproduce these meta-analyses by re-extracting effect sizes from original articles. The general approach will be pre-registered on the Open Science Framework, in which will provide estimates of the reproducibility of effect size extraction and also an analysis of the causes of any discrepancies identified. Finding large discrepancies and a large number of errors will demonstrate the importance of raising current standards of transparency for meta-analyses. The 3 main questions are: how difficult is it to reproduce published meta-analyses in psychology? What is the impact of subjective choices on the meta-analytic effect size estimate? The larger the effect of different subjective choices on the effect size estimate, the stronger the case for increased transparency about these choices, and also enabling colleagues to recalculate the meta-analytic effect size estimates based on different justifiable choices. And finally, the third question is, do conclusions change when novel meta-analytic techniques are applied to published data sets? We'll employ 3 novel meta-analytic techniques. The first one being the P-curve analysis by Leif, Yuri, and Joe. Second one, a P-uniform by Robbie and colleague Van Asan. And thirdly, a meta-regression meta-analytic technique. And again, if the meta-analytic effect size estimates in the original meta-analysis differs substantially from the effect size estimates using these more novel techniques, we will interpret this as support for the importance of enabling the scientific community to more easily reanalyze published meta-analyses as new statistical techniques become available. The intended impacts for psychology as a discipline is to potentially contribute to theory development. Intended impacts for policy would be potential implications for applied interventions. And also we will create reusable R code and a Shiny app that researchers will be able to use for reproducing other meta-analyses. Thank you.
The project I'm working on is to try to develop methodologies to aggregate distributional treatment effects when you're not sure that the effects that you're studying are the same across the different contexts. And I'm going to apply that to the microcredit literature. So distributional treatment effects, most broadly, are kind of quantile treatment effects. So you want to estimate an entire sort of difference function between the outcome distribution for the treatment and control groups, or the various levels of sort of treatment groups. It also encompasses things like variance treatment effects, which are really important in economics in general. We're not just interested in what happens to the mean or level of an outcome. We want to know what happens to the variance. That has interpretation in terms of inequality, but it also has interpretation in terms of uncertainty and risk that individuals face. It can be hard to sort of separate those out, and I'll talk a bit about that. But the whole issue is much more complicated when you're not sure that the different studies that you're aggregating from or that you're meta-analyzing study the same treatment effects or have the same dominant mechanisms. When you're looking at average treatment effects, mean treatment effects, then you can use sort of Bayesian hierarchical models or other sorts of random effects analysis to do the aggregation in the presence of that uncertainty and to quantify the extent of that heterogeneity and actually incorporate that knowledge into your analysis. It's not so straightforward when you're trying to do the same thing for distributional treatment effects. The main issue is that in the case of quantile treatment effects, there's strong monotonicity constraints on the quantile treatment effects that have to be respected. That typically, if you were to estimate quantile by quantile the effect, you wouldn't respect those. That problem's going to be exacerbated when you try to aggregate them in a partial pooling framework. So we need a way to aggregate treatment effects that's agnostic about the heterogeneity between them, but those treatment effects are now functions. So you have to do that in function space, which is difficult. Variance treatment effects have 2 issues. One is that they have a support constraint that's natural to them, so you can't have a negative variance. The treatment effect, therefore, has a stochastic support constraint. In addition, it's hard to interpret what you find when you get a variance treatment effect. If the agents that you're studying know more than you do about the outcomes, that they can forecast them, then you're not studying risk, you're studying heterogeneity that they know about. And there are going to be ways that you can sort of figure out what they know and orthogonalize that, but again, it's very complicated when you're trying to do that while you're aggregating. So the goal of this project is to use the framework of Bayesian hierarchical models and extend it to cases where we want to aggregate quantile treatment effects, variance treatment effects in a disciplined way. What motivated this is the application to microcredit. So I've been working with the seven randomized controlled trials of microcredit expansions. I have all the sort of original data of that, and I've done the aggregation of the mean treatment effects. But what we often see from people in the policy world and from other economists is the complaint that they don't just care about the average treatment effect. They want to know, is there distributional treatment effects? Does this affect inequality? Are we mitigating risk? Is microcredit actually used to smooth consumption rather than being used to increase profits? And those would be really important, and we would need to know those things in order to really understand the sort of impact of microcredit. And if we don't use those things, then it doesn't matter how rigorously we're sort of aggregating along one dimension if we're missing what's really important in terms of welfare for the sort of subjects that we're intervening on, then we're missing a huge part of the scientific picture. So I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to kind of get more traction understanding the economics of what we're doing if we have these methods available. I'm hoping that they could be applied more generally in economics. Because it's not just microcredit where we worry about distributional treatment effects, it's really insurance products, general kind of financial products. And so I'm definitely going to produce R packages. We're not so sure about Stata, it depends on how that goes, but certainly R packages so that other researchers can implement these themselves. And then with the application to microcredit, my hope is that this could be a sort of source of informative, useful, well-packaged information that policymakers could go to so that they can better make decisions themselves in the future about whether they want to fund microcredit, what might be the impact of microcredit. And so I kind of have this twofold contribution that I'm hoping to make there. And hopefully we'll see this as part of a broader project of getting better methodology for aggregation, which is really crucial to getting more reliable literatures rather than just having reliable studies.
First, I wanted to thank SIGA, BITSS, and of course, in particular, the Arnold Foundation for funding all of this. It's amazing to hear about everything that everyone's doing. I'm Leif Nelson, and over the last few years, me and my co-authors, Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson, developed a statistical tool called P-Curve, which is designed to identify the presence of evidential value in published work. That is, if you can think of null hypothesis significance testing as discriminating between truth and versus sampling error, this is a tool that across multiple studies is designed to discriminate between mere selective reporting and true evidence. So the tool exists, and it occasionally gets applied to certain areas, but what my project aims to do is to try to say, can we characterize changes within psychology over the last number of years and across journals as a way of seeing all of the efforts towards increased transparency and disclosure and how they've been differentially adopted in adjacent fields or adjacent journals? Can we characterize how the changes in evidential value have adjusted as a function of those? That is, if we look prior to 2010 or 2011, is there more evidence of p-hacking and selective reporting than there is now? And does that matter more in a field like social psychology versus cognitive psychology versus consumer psychology? So our goal is to slowly build up this data. That is, anyone who tells you it is fast to pull together a meta-analysis has obviously never done it before. And so that's most of what we want to do. And then at the very far end, we hope to use sort of the one absolute standard of science, and that is to do at least some small number of absolute direct replications to add validity to the inferences that come with our claims. If all this goes well, we should be able to build at least a small but meaningful data set of the distribution of these p-values and evidential value that people can look at. Claims that add validity and strength to those people who are fighting to make science more valid. And then a handful of findings that can tell us exactly about the strength of those original claims. Thanks.
Okay, my name's Sean Tanner. I'm a doctoral student here in the policy school at Berkeley. And my primary question is, how confidently can we extrapolate from a single study in US education research? So pretty straightforward question. And that really breaks down into two primary sub-questions. So one asks about how stable treatment effects are within interventions, but across studies. We have some evidence from the developing world that they're not particularly stable, that there's a great amount of variance within studies of the same intervention, but across different trials. And the other is really asking, how do study samples map onto the larger population of students in the United States, which are the targets of these policies and programs? And there's some concern, obviously, that there's not, but we don't really have great data about that. And so that is the basic research setup. The motivation for this comes from two sort of separate tracks. One is that the federal government has pretty clear evidence ranking schemes in the way that they distribute funds. For instance, the Obama administration's Investing in Innovation initiative delivered about $1 billion in grant money to particular educational programs. Those educational programs that had been validated by a single site randomized control trial were available to get $30 million per program. If you had a multi-site RCT, you got $50 million at your cap. And if you had a natural experiment, there was something in between there. And it was this complicated evidence ranking scheme, and we don't have any reason to think, I mean, that was a pretty good stab at it, but we have no idea if that is justified by the data. And so that's sort of one thing. There's a real price tag on misallocating research and programmatic funding. And then the academic question is really, there are several pretty high profile cases in which we think we've nailed a treatment effect down in either through experiments or a high quality natural experiment. And then when we've implemented that policy en masse, the treatment effects disappear. And the most known of that is Project STAR in Tennessee. So this is one of the most cited RCTs in education research. Maybe some of you, the others, have learned about it in your methods class. I mean, more papers than there were students in the trial. But we think, I mean, it's pretty stable that, especially for lower performing students, reducing their class size has an increase on their cognitive score. Now, I just want to take a minute to think about how simple the intervention of reduced class size is. Right, so it's very simple. You take a class from 25 and you put it down to 13, full stop. That's a pretty simple protocol to follow. Okay, when we try to do this in California about 7 years later, what do you think the effect is? 0? It's actually worse than 0. It looked like it hurt the kids at the lower end of the cognitive spectrum. Okay, so that's just one high profile example. And implementation probably can't explain a lot of that. Conversely, there have been now 6 experiments of linking teachers' salary bonuses to student test scores. 5 of those experiments have continued to show 0 treatment effect on student scores for incentivizing their teachers financially, sometimes considerably, for increasing those scores. Okay, Chicago, Boston, New York, so a variety of RCTs. One natural experiment of the policy as actually implemented in the DC public schools, and you get a pretty sizable treatment effect. So it's actually not clear that it is always attenuated from the RCT. It may just be that our academic studies don't predict policy impacts very well. So that's sort of the motivation, is to see that. The audience for this, thanks, is that for the academic conversation is, can we reduce, predict, or even explain why this divergence is happening? Are there elements, are there study characteristics that reduce this variance within interventions? And then the policy implication is, should we have a better evidence ranking scheme that takes into account some of the features of studies that help reduce predictive error? And that's that.
So hello, my name is Robbie van Aert, and our research will be about publication bias within psychology. And publication bias is essentially a big problem within psychology because there are usually multiple small studies, so there are low sample sizes within psychology, and as a consequence, researchers can conduct multiple studies because it's not expensive, and therefore they can only report statistically significant ones. This has severe consequences because, first of all, it can, of course, cause overestimation in the effect size estimates. Because if only the statistically significant results get published, they usually have larger effect sizes. And therefore, the effect size will be overestimation. And second, what is also important is that the publication bias may yield a false impression that an effect actually exists, while it does not. Because if you as a researcher read the literature and you see that there is every time a relationship between two variables, you may conclude that there is such an effect, but if the non-statistically significant results do not get published, then this is actually a false impression. So I was also a member of the analysis committee of the Reproducibility project, in which 100 psychological studies were replicated. And also over there, what you see is that the original studies have way larger effect sizes than the replication. So it also shows that there is an overestimation. So what we actually need is a method that can do three things. So first of all, can accurately estimate the effect size when there is publication bias. Can also test for the existence of an effect, taking into account publication bias, and finally also can reliably test for publication bias within a meta-analysis. And we proposed such a method called the p-uniform method. So this method can do all these three things. And in general, the method outperforms other existing methods for examining for publication bias. So a bit of advertisement. If you want to use the method yourself, we developed an easy-to-use R package. And also, for the persons who are not familiar with R, we also developed an easy-to-use web application. So if you want to use and apply the method to your own data, please let me know, and I can point you to either to the R package or the web application. So what we will do in the research is we will focus on publication bias within psychology, but also compare and study the amount of publication bias within medical research. Because within medical research, there's a longer history of taking into account for publication bias and also pre-registration. So we expect that there's a difference between the two. So what we will do is we will create a large-scale database of psychological meta-analyses and also meta-analyses from medical research. And based on this database, we will try to answer three questions. So first of all, we will examine whether there is in general an overestimation in effect size in each meta-analysis, and we do that by comparing the effect size estimate of traditional meta-analysis methods with the estimate of p-uniform, in which is corrected for publication bias. Then we will also, for each meta-analysis, we will test whether there is publication bias. So to get an insight into to what extent there is publication bias within psychology and medical research. And finally, we will also, for each meta-analysis, test whether there is an effect while taking into account publication bias, also by means of p-uniform, to examine whether there indeed is an effect in each meta-analysis if we take into account publication bias. So hopefully the impact it will have is twofold. So on the one side, we hope to increase the awareness of publication bias, and also we want to get more insight in the extent of publication bias. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah White, and I'm actually a member of the SIGA team working on our technology initiative, part of which is the launch of the Development Engineering Journal. So I thought I'd first just introduce the journal. We're a new open access interdisciplinary journal focused on technology for international development, led by Paul Gertler, as you can see pictured up there, and also Ashok Gadgil of civil engineering at UC Berkeley. And the journals, our publisher for the journal is Elsevier. And what we're really trying to do is bridge engineers, economists, and other social scientists working in technology for international development, and to create a space for them to publish in an interdisciplinary way. We're open for submissions now and on a rolling basis, so if anybody in here is working or interested in this space, I encourage you to check us out. But as for the grant, basically what we're trying to do is to pilot what we think is a new approach for incorporating replication into the publishing process. So, and here we define replication as pure verification of the research itself. We basically want to make sure that we can duplicate results as published in manuscripts or as published in articles. And we're going to do this in a couple of ways. So first, we'll, of course, request that all of our submitting authors post their data and code online. And then we will subject all of our accepted articles to potentially 2 different levels of replication. So the first being every article that's accepted prior to publication will run their data and code just to make sure that the tables can be reproduced as shown in the manuscript. And then second, we will, for a random subset of articles, actually do a full replication of the manuscript itself by an independent replicator. So we want to make sure that we can create the same sample from the raw data and ultimately produce the same results. And I would say the goal of this ultimately is to create what we hope will be a positive incentive structure in which we're kind of avoiding fishing exercises, but instead placing the onus on the authors themselves to put their most careful and accurate work forward. And I would also say we're going to be doing surveys with the authors themselves that are submitting to our journal to try to understand how they react to this, if this disincentivizes them to publish with us as a new journal. And then we also want to survey some other folks that have undergone replications of their work through other avenues to understand, again, how authors are responding to this process and how we can develop some best practices for other journals moving forward. In terms of impacts, again, we want to create this positive incentive structure of replication within the journal publishing process, but also for us as a new journal and as a new field, we want to make sure that, of course, our results are as accurate and reliable as possible, especially in the context of different of this research having different policy implications. And I guess I'll just end by saying that we'd be happy to discuss this further and learn from feedback that any of you all have in the room as we think about implementing this. So thank you.
Hi, so I'm Eva, and this is joint work with Aidan Koval at the World Bank. So suppose I were to tell you that a microfinance program improves consumption by 10%. Well, does microfinance then really improve consumption? Well, we don't know. There can be false positives and false negatives. In this case, it's probably a false positive. But all right, so there's actually good reason to believe that a lot of our research results could be false positives. There's this great study by Ioannidis called Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, where he goes through this and does some simulations, and at least in his simulations, it seems like most results are actually false. So then how do we know whether a study is true or false? Well, this will depend on several things. It depends on the priors. It depends on the power of the study and the sort of the level of significance you're considering. And already sort of in my database from 8th grade, I've got some of these things a bit. You can look at what at least the power would have been given the sample size. And the main thing that's sort of missing here is the powers. So, there's the priors. So we're going to be collecting priors to try to see, to try to say more about this false positive, false negative reporting rate. And okay, so how do we collect priors? Well, there's several ways of going about this. First, for the studies that are in the World Bank system that they have sort of done, there are some early project documents that say something about, sometimes they say power calculation, sometimes they say something about minimum detectable effect. It depends. So we're a little bit hesitant of leaning too hard on that, especially since you can easily imagine somebody is already told that there will be a study and it will have a certain size to it, and sort of there might be some people willing to accept sort of lower power but trying to make it look nice. So that's one source of priors, but one that we're a little bit cautious about. The other cool thing about working this awesome collaboration here is that we're actually able to survey people at some conferences that the World Bank puts on, where it has both researchers and policymakers. So you can actually ask people, look, here's a set of studies. Which of these studies are you aware of? For some of these studies you're not aware of, here's some characteristics of these studies. What do you think, what would be your expectation about the effect size that they would have found? So that's really neat. You can get both researchers and you also get policymakers. So at that point, it's really easy to also present some actual evidence and see how policymakers update, just as a quick thing that there's not currently very much evidence about, and it's a super important question, like how do we present results in such a way that we can actually motivate policymakers to sort of, if we're doing these studies for the sake of evidence-based policymaking, presumably there's some ways of changing people's priors more than others. So that's a second way of eliciting priors. A third thing is also the cleanest thing is to say, look, let's get a set of studies that don't have currently working papers publicly available. And then we can go to the experts and really say, okay, well, here's now like a prediction market, essentially, for what these studies will find. Studies that sort of are nearing at least some first results, but don't have a currently publicly available paper. So we can get to see again what people's priors would be for those particular studies. So all this is going back to getting the sense of the false positives, and it's also nice because it could potentially help encourage people to use better, larger sample sizes to get better power. Because if you think about it, well, actually, what you can see already looking with 8th grades data is if you see a distribution of effect sizes that were actually found in the papers, and you compare that with the distribution of effect sizes that you would have needed to have had in order for that particular sample size to have had 80% power or whatever, those two distributions look almost completely distinct from each other. Studies are massively underpowered, so this can sort of help to highlight that.